Good afternoon, everybody. Admittedly, this is the first time I've ever given a presentation on one leg, so bear with me. I will do my best. So here to talk to you about the Gulf 2023 model, kind of talk about Gulf Coast land subsidence in the greater Houston area, and then just go over the preliminary modeling results. So just to start off with, the Gulf 2023 project, which Gulf stands for Gulf Coast Land Subsidence and Groundwater Flow Model. It was initiated by the Harris-Galveston and Fort Bend subsidence districts as an update to the previous groundwater availability model, i.e. a GAM, about 3 years ago. So this model replaces the Houston area groundwater model, i.e. the HAGM, which itself replaced the NGC GAM that was released back in 2004. So that's kind of the basis for this model, and it's incorporates a number of modeling advances. In the last 10 years, things have changed a little bit in the modeling world, right? I mean, we have spatially distributed recharge, we have new uncertainty frameworks and uncertainty methods. So there's multiple updates to include also a new modeling code, ModFlow 6. So if you look at the study area, this area, as you can see there from seeing the Texas outline and then seeing the study area, this area is essentially known as Groundwater Management Area 14. And then the study area also includes part of Groundwater Management Area 15 there on the bottom left of the screen. So it goes all the way to the Texas-Louisiana border on the right side there, and then to the southwest it stops at the border of Lavaca and Jackson counties. So looking at the model configuration, this model has 6 layers, and for the first time for a GAM, this model includes the Catahoula Formation, also known as the Catahoula Confining Unit. The Chico, Evangeline, and Jasper aquifers, the Burkeville Confining Unit, and the Catahoula all form together the Gulf Coast Aquifer System. So this is the first model that includes the entire Gulf Coast Aquifer System as part of the model. That's part of the GAM anyways. Layer 1 is also a little different, and then that superficial layer is used to route recharge in the model. So it's a superficial 50-foot thick layer. And then below that, you then have each of the hydrogeologic units. Now, as those of you that have done this sort of thing know, as you go back earlier in time, there's less data available, right? So early in time, the model stress periods are much longer, and they narrow little by little until you get down to monthly stress periods in the year 2000. Again, that's due to the fact that there's not much data available early on, so there's no need to have something at a monthly level in terms of the model time step. So if you cut the model in half and you look at the cross section, this is what you see. Again, I mentioned earlier that ModFlow 6 is the code. So, that was released in 2017 by Chris Longevin, Joe Hughes, and others, and this model does use it. There are some advantages of using ModFlow 6, and for, again, those of you that have used it may be aware of these. One of them is, if you have model layers that crop out, you have to obviously, in the older codes, continue those model cells even though they don't really serve any purpose. Well, here you can actually do pass-through cells. So now the water would route from, say, layer 1 to layer 3 if layer 2 is cropped out. So this model does use that advancement. It's called iDomain. Cell spacing is about 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer on the side, slightly smaller than the mile cells you normally get. Recharge is simulated using the recharge package compared to using a general head boundary package that many of the previous GAMs have used. And I'll get to that a little bit more here in a minute. Subsidence uses the skeletal storage and subsidence package, the CISA package released by Joe Hughes about 3 months ago, and that's the subsidence package from ModFlow 6. Other than that, offshore, use general head boundary, and streams use the river package for main stems, and then drains for the smaller ones. So to that last point, you can see on here on the slide, the darker lines are the river cells for all the main rivers. You can see there Lavaca, Colorado, Brazos, and others, and then the drain cells are for all the non-intermittent and ephemeral streams in the study area. The whole purpose of this configuration is to route out that deluge of precip that becomes recharge in the shallow area that does not enter the deeper parts of the model, and which largely reflects real life because most of that recharge does not percolate down into the deeper layers of the aquifer. So that's just kind of the surface water routing setup. So if you look at recharge, this is done a little differently than has been done in the past, but it uses a method that's very familiar for those of you who've done it, and the code it uses, the soil water balance code, has been out for about 10 years now. So soil water balance code is used to spatially distribute recharge and precipitation recharge using a combination of tabular data sets like precipitation data, minimum maximum temperature data, and then rasterized data like water capacity, soil hydrologic group, land use, land cover, and then digital elevation models data to produce estimates, spatially distributed estimates of recharge. And we're blessed in the GMA 14 and eastern part of GMA 15 area in the Gulf Coast with a lot of long-term data. For anybody that's done any sort of studies that involve precipitation data, you know there's a lot of long-term data. There's 106 climate stations that we use to estimate recharge in this area. 10 of them have data from before 1900 all the way to present day. So there's a lot of data available in this area to do any number of studies. Okay, the next piece of this is groundwater use. So model groundwater use is always a difficult thing for anybody that's ever tried, ever attempted to work on groundwater use, to estimate it. It's not very fun, admittedly. It's one of those things that's very difficult to get your hands around. I mean, the reality of it would seem easy, right? You just have a meter on all your pumps and you record all of that, but that's just not what we have. So model groundwater use for this project was redone compared to previous models in order to better spatially distribute that groundwater use and provide an update and enhancement to the previous models. And that was done by Intera. If you look at the map there on the right side of the screen, you see the spatial distribution of that groundwater use. You see all the tan representing the Chico down dip, and then as you start moving up dip through the aquifer units, then you start seeing the deeper aquifer units that are then outcropping at the surface, and as they get towards the surface, that's the main aquifer that is used in that area. And just as a side note, on the bottom right of the screen there, that is a picture of the original 1879 Houston Waterworks plant. Okay, talk about groundwater levels for a second. So changes in groundwater levels occur because of changes in the volume of water stored in the aquifer, and that was covered just earlier for this presentation. So if you look at the slide there on the right side of the slide there, that map, as you can see, there's a lot of groundwater levels, of which those are largely long-term wells available in that area. Again, it's an amazing data set available for use for this sort of thing, whether it's modeling or otherwise. Now, one of the things you notice if you look at the left side of the screen is that bottom left hydrograph there. You notice how it starts off at around 60, 70 feet below land surface, and then from there you just see this plunge in groundwater levels all the way down to the historical minimums in about 1975. That is very representative of what you see through time in the areas of historical water use, which would include the downtown Houston area, Baytown, Pasadena, Texas City, those sorts of areas. So I only show one hydrograph over here, but this is largely what you see almost everywhere in those areas. Now you contrast that to the hydrograph at the top of the screen, that is in Conroe. As you see, the decline in groundwater levels occurred much later in time. And if you look laterally across the other counties, you see largely the same thing. So that's just one of the themes that you see in the study area, that south to north divide there, and those changes in groundwater levels occurring in different periods. Okay, talk about groundwater levels as they're implemented in the model. There's a great number of groundwater levels through time, obviously, as more and more water levels measurements are taken. So USGS in October of 1930 started a groundwater level monitoring program among the first of its kind in the state in cooperation with the city of Houston. And that was due to those declines that you see here on this graph there at the bottom left of the screen. Those declines were starting to occur in earnest, and the city wanted to have a look at those along with the Texas Board of Water Engineering at the time. So I began those studies, and those have continued, those annual measurements have continued through time to present day, and even more so starting in the 70s and 80s, and then in 2000 in cooperation from the Harris, Galveston, Fort Bend subsidence districts. So if you look at the bottom part of the screen there, you'll see that multicolored chart. That just shows you the groundwater levels available through time. Now, obviously, as you would expect, it starts out small, and then it gets bigger as you get more groundwater levels available. Now to note, because the annual measurements are taken December to February of each year on that top graph, you see that most of those groundwater levels occur during those periods, and that's what's in the model. So there's less measurements available at other points during the year. Okay, so I'll talk about subsidence, land subsidence here for a second. I know that many of you are probably familiar with it, or at least have heard of it. So land subsidence does occur across the Gulf Coast aquifer system and east and west laterally of Texas. So this is something that's been going on in a number of areas for a long time. And if you haven't heard of it here, I'm sure you may have seen the pictures from California, the Central Valley, where you can see subsidence of almost 30 feet in some of those areas. And that means literally the land has sunk 30 feet. So the basics of it are the weight of overlying rock and water is balanced by the pore fluid pressure. And this is the principle of effective stress. It means your effective stress is equal to the difference of the geostatic and the hydrostatic stresses. So as your groundwater levels decline, that pore fluid pressure, as that decreases, a portion of that load is shifted from the confining fluid to the skeleton of the aquifer system, and that results in basically it getting squished, it getting compacted. And when I'm saying it's getting compacted, I'm talking about the fine-grained sediment, the silts and the clays. Those are what compact in the aquifer system, or the majority of what compacts. Now the thing is if those decline in groundwater levels, that decline in pore fluid pressure is less than the pre-consolidation drawdown, which is the maximum stress the aquifer was subjected to before modern pumping methods effectively, that subsidence is recoverable. It is elastic. However, if that decline is greater, it is inelastic and therefore permanent. And just a note, in the large part of the greater Houston area, because of those groundwater level declines you see there in the bottom left side of the screen, when you see that everywhere, it means essentially your compaction in large places is permanent, even though the water levels you see there later in time rise and come back up. The water levels do not rise back up to the original level, and that compaction is permanent. Okay, so the question may come up is, how do you measure subsidence? What do you do with that? And there's really four main methods. The first one is to use a borehole extensometer, and then you can also use leveling techniques, GPS techniques, and then INSAR as well. So I'll talk about 3 of the 4 of those. So an extensometer, if you haven't seen one before, there are 14 of them in the Houston area at 12 sites. If anybody here has ever seen a benchmark, basically think of it as a deeply anchored benchmark. That's more or less what you get there. So you drill a well down to, say, X amount of feet below where all the water use is occurring in the aquifer system in that area. And then you run a thick pipe, an inner pipe, all the way down the middle. You cement it at the bottom, and that pipe is sticking out at land surface on top of a concrete pad. You then have something called a chart recorder, an F recorder. It looks like a seismograph. And then you attach a cable to the top of that pipe, run it over the wheel of the hydrograph, and weight it on the other side. So as your land starts to subside, that pipe starts to be higher and higher out of the land surface effectively, and it moves the wheel, and it basically creates what I call a subsidograph, but essentially it looks like a seismograph if you looked at the readouts. So the first extensometer was installed in 1958 in this area. I mean, it goes quite far back, and that was at the East End extensometer site. The second one was at Johnson Space Center over there in 1962. Now both of those failed, so they had to get replaced. But all of them were installed either in 1973 or by 1980. And if you look at the bottom left side of the slide there, you'll see that those are not anchored. Those wells that are drilled, they're not drilled down to the same depth all over. They took the water use into account, the depth at which that water is withdrawn in the aquifer system right in that area when they planned where to install that extensometer. So for example, I don't know if you can see the text from there, I hope so, but Baytown has a Baytown shallow and a deep extensometer, and that's for a reason. Almost all the historical water use in Baytown occurred from wells screened shallower than about 550 feet. So they have a shallow well, they have a shallow extensometer screened at right about 550 feet, and then they have a deep one to account for the water use in Pasadena, 8 miles west of there, that affected groundwater levels all the way over in Baytown. So they planned ahead and they thought about this back in the 70s and 60s when they put these in. Okay, this is the second way you can measure subsidence, and it's through benchmarks. So I'm sure if you look at the bottom left of the screen there, you see those brass benchmarks. You've probably seen photos of them, seen examples, maybe you've even actually seen one. These benchmarks were monumented starting in 1906, many years ago, and subsequent leveling lines installed many more of them. And you have this wealth of long-term subsidence data through this benchmark data sets. You can see there the greater Houston area, you can see how many are there. This that you see on the slide is just the most long-term that existed from at least 1943 to 1987. In terms of total monuments, there were thousands that were installed, but some of them were destroyed within years of getting installed because of the growth of the urban area. There is no benchmark police. If it gets destroyed, and that data is lost. So this is the long-term network of benchmarks that are either still around now or still around to at least 1987. So if you look at the lines there, the first line that was ran was in 1906, and it came from west of the greater Houston area through Waller County all the way down to central Houston and then cut southeast to Galveston. It ran along basically what is modern-day I-10. And then you had multiple other leveling lines that were done in the interim, and this just shows you the earliest ones. So 1906, 1918, 1932, and there was also in 1915, USGS did quite a few leveling lines in the area as well. Those are just the earlier ones. National Geodetic Survey did a lot of these, and they came back again in 1936, 43, 51, 54, 59, 64, 71, 73, 76, 78, 87. So there were many, many leveling lines done. So if you difference those over time, you get to see a cumulative subsidence graph, which I'm going to show you here in a second. Just quickly look at this. This is the modern GPS network that has replaced doing those leveling lines in much of the greater Houston area and in many places. These are run by the Harris, Galveston, Fort Bend subsidence districts in cooperation with many other entities and processed by the University of Houston. So this is their data set. This is not necessarily a USGS data set. I show you this so you can see what is in place right now. And you can go to their website and actually see an ArcGIS online map that shows you the vertical displacement rates for all of these sites. And I would note these are not the only sites. These are just the most long-term ones. So earlier I told you that if you take all those benchmarks, all of those leveled elevations, you subtract them, you can actually get a time series of subsidence through time. And that is what you see right here at the Easton Extensometer. This is in southeastern Houston. It's the site of a former City of Houston facility. This is very indicative of what you see in the historical areas as far as subsidence goes. You see the subsidence beginning fairly early, and then after about 1943, the groundwater levels continued to decline and decline. You pass that pre-consolidation drawdown, and then the subsidence rate increases. So I won't spend too much time on these, just to try to get to the rest of the presentation. But this is historically what you see in many of those areas in Harris County. This is Baytown. You see much of the same thing, just a bit more earlier subsidence. And then if you look at the Katy area, benchmark Y7, which is one of those original 1906 benchmarks that is still around today, you see less subsidence in the Katy area. And that is because of a few factors. The Pasadena area and the Baytown area, they have a greater percentage of silt and clay, and the groundwater use was much more concentrated. In the central Harris County area, it was a bit more spatially distributed by design by the city. And by the time you get over to the Katy area, it's even more spatially distributed historically than all those other areas. And in addition, it contains less fine-grained sediment, and it also has a large proximity to the outcrop area, which is the dashed line there on the map. Okay, just quickly go through the last couple of slides here. So this is the subsidence package that we use for the model, bringing all this back into the model now. We use a combination of delay beds and no delay beds, and this is an advantage over previous GAMs where no delay beds are used, which basically means the subsidence happens instantly. And of course, in reality, that has not necessarily happened. So this is another one of those advantages of using this package. Looking at the model history matching, just to note, I keep saying model, but this is not actually just a single model. It's an ensemble of models. Using the PEST IES code, we're able to actually use an ensemble of models with many realizations, one of which was pulled out and called the Gulf model. So that's kind of how that works. I'm going to quickly skip through some of these to be able to get to the results so you can see these. So the shaded line, the shaded area behind the lines there on the right side of the screen, that is the ensemble results. It's probably a little difficult to tell on the slides, but the dark gray line in the middle is the Gulf model, and then the black is the observed data. So overall, after doing many calibration runs with this model, we're pretty happy with the results, and it largely matches those drawdowns through time that you see there on the screen. This shows you Fort Bend, again, largely the same thing. We didn't entirely match the drawdowns in some of the areas, or we slightly over-simulated in a few others. So this is the observed simulated water levels in Montgomery County. So lower Montgomery County in the Jasper Aquifer, we weren't able to completely simulate all those drawdowns. That's probably because we simulated the Jasper as a single layer. There's much greater amount of clay in the lower part versus the upper part, and when you simulate it together, it just means that you may not be able to fully get at those drawdowns. Looking at the recharge just quickly here, this is the simulated recharge. When you apply it to the land surface in the model, this is what you see. Almost all of it, and the vast majority of it occurs in the outcrop area, which in real life is what you expect to see. So that was good to see that. Again, only a very small amount of this actually percolates down into the aquifer, deeper into the aquifer, into layers 2 through 5. So you can see those values there on the very bottom bullet. About 1/3 of an inch for the Chico, about 1/5 of an inch for the Evangeline, Jasper, Catahoula are very small amounts. I will leave you with this slide as the last slide. This shows you the water budget. This is the average annual water budget for the model. So if you go back from 1897 all the way to 2018, this is the average budget that you see. Basically, all the inflows are recharged in the model, the vast majority of which occur in the outcrop area. Almost all the water coming out is either groundwater use or stream seepage. Now, if you look at the inflows and the outflows, you look at those numbers, obviously those are not even. There is a very big deficit of outflows compared to inflows. So if you difference those, the middle pie chart right there, the green is the difference. That's almost 400,000 acre-feet lost from the aquifer long-term since 1897. And most of that is due to either groundwater pumping, just water derived from specific yield under confined conditions, or it is due to the water derived from subsidence, specifically from inelastic compaction. That is a one-time mining of water, and it is permanent. So with that said, I'm going to stop the presentation here to stay on.